5 ways a super empath is silently crushing an avoidance pride. You know what's funny about emotional strength? It's not always loud. It's not always flashy. Sometimes real power moves in silence. And if you're someone with deep emotional intelligence, what we might call a super empath, you know exactly what I mean. Now, let's talk about the avoidant. The person who runs when it gets real. The one who flinches at vulnerability, who confuses distance with control and thinks detachment is a badge of honor. But here's the plot twist. While the avoidant thinks they're staying in control, the super empath is doing something far more powerful. Not by chasing, not by begging, but by simply standing in their truth. And that is silently crushing the avoidance pride. Let me break down exactly how. When a super empath engages with an avoidant, something subtle but incredibly powerful happens. They don't chase. Instead, they choose. This isn't about playing games or withholding affection. It's about deeply understanding their own value and refusing to barter it for the bare minimum. While an avoidant is used to people proving themselves, tiptoeing around their walls and fighting to be let in, a super empath responds differently. They might lean in with care at first, sensing the emotional turbulence behind the avoidant's cold exterior. But once they see the pattern, the pulling away, the deflection, the fear disguised as independence, they make a quiet decision. A super empath isn't desperate for connection. They want authentic connection. And when someone keeps them in a loop of uncertainty, they don't spiral, they observe. That pause, that stillness, is the beginning of everything shifting. The avoidant might interpret that calm as detachment or indifference, but it's not. It's the empath moving into discernment, asking themselves whether this situation aligns with their self-worth or just triggers their healing wounds. This discernment separates the super empath from someone who's emotionally reactive. They don't rush to fix. They don't internalize the rejection. Instead, they ask better questions. Does this person have the capacity to meet me? Is my love being mirrored or managed? While the avoidant retreats into space, believing they've regained control, the super empath uses that very silence to gather their own clarity. And once they've decided something no longer serves their emotional peace, they don't beg, they don't prove, they don't over-explain. That quiet decision not to chase isn't rooted in bitterness. It's rooted in self-respect. It's a refusal to participate in an emotional dynamic where they're always reaching and the other person is always running. That choice, made with grace and not resentment, breaks the cycle. And here's where the shift really happens. The avoidant, so accustomed to being the one with the upper hand, starts to feel the space that the super empath leaves behind. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, but it's deeply unsettling to someone who thought emotional distance gave them power. Suddenly, the one who always had control isn't being pursued anymore. That pride they held, it gets chipped away. Not through confrontation, but through the quiet power of someone who knows they're worthy of more. The super empath doesn't chase because they know they are the prize. And that truth, when finally realized, echoes louder than any goodbye. A super empath understands the depth of emotion, not just in others, but within themselves. They're not afraid to feel, to connect, or to love fully. But that doesn't mean they tolerate emotional chaos, especially with someone who operates from an avoidant attachment style. The super empath's ability to set clear, unapologetic boundaries becomes their quiet rebellion. They don't yell to be heard. They don't threaten to walk away to manipulate. They simply draw a line with calm certainty and they hold it without guilt. Avoidants often operate under the assumption that emotional closeness means loss of freedom. They test boundaries subtly. They push limits by withdrawing, withholding affection, or deflecting conversations that feel too intimate. In the past, they might have dealt with people who allowed that dynamic, people who twisted themselves into emotional contortions to avoid conflict. But with a super empath, that strategy falls flat. The empath doesn't fall into the trap of trying to manage someone else's comfort at the expense of their own. They can love someone deeply and still say, this behavior doesn't work for me. The moment the super empath senses that their emotional needs are consistently dismissed or minimized, they act not with drama, but with clarity. They articulate their boundaries without anger, not because they're cold, but because they've done the work. They're not looking to control anyone. They're simply protecting their own inner peace. They might say, if you need space, that's okay, but I won't continue this connection without honesty. Or, I care about you, but I won't stay in a relationship where I feel like a burden for wanting intimacy. This kind of communication is disarming to the avoidant, who's used to emotional overreactions or quiet resentment. The super empath doesn't give them either. They speak their truth and stand by it even when it means risking the relationship. That willingness to let go, rather than bend their needs to fit someone else's limitations, is what makes their boundaries so powerful. It's not a performance, it's protection. Avoidants, in their pride, often see boundaries as threats. But the super empath doesn't set them to punish, they set them to honor themselves. There's no ultimatum, no chase, no guilt trip, just a firm, loving reminder. I know what I bring, and I won't shrink to stay connected. And that calm certainty, free of blame, full of self-respect, is often what shakes the avoidant most. When a super empath decides to create distance, it's never about punishment, it's about preservation. It's about preservation. They don't disappear to manipulate emotions or provoke fear of loss. They do it because they finally realize their emotional availability is being taken for granted. And while the avoidant might be used to people reacting with emotional outbursts, chasing after them, or desperately trying to fix the disconnect, the super empath withdraws with grace. They don't slam the door. They simply stop holding it open. What makes this withdrawal so powerful is its calmness. There's no explosive exit, no accusations, no dramatic pleas, just a subtle but unmistakable shift. The calls slow down, the texts stop first. The emotional presence that once felt like a warm blanket suddenly isn't there anymore. And the avoidant, who always thought distance made them feel safer, begins to feel something unfamiliar. Emptiness. You see, avoidants often crave closeness just as much as anyone else, but they fear it. So they push it away, test limits, or sabotage intimacy. They expect the other person to keep showing up, to keep proving they're safe, to keep holding space. But the super empath doesn't play that game forever. Once they see that their emotional energy is being drained without reciprocity, they detach, not from a place of anger, but from wisdom. They've learned that being emotionally available to someone who is emotionally unavailable is a recipe for pain. So they step back, not in silence, but in self-protection. This subtle disappearance can be profoundly unsettling for the avoidant. They're used to having emotional control by creating distance, but now someone else has created the distance. And they didn't do it with drama, they did it with dignity. That's what cuts deeper. The super empath hasn't closed their heart, they've just closed access to it. And that kind of silence, it's louder than shouting. It makes the avoidant realize they weren't just being given love, they were being given presence, consistency, emotional safety. And now it's gone. It's often in this moment that the avoidant begins to feel the very thing they thought they could avoid. Vulnerability, because what they once assumed would always be there is no longer within reach. And they're left with the truth that the empath's kindness wasn't weakness, it was a choice. And now that choice has changed. Not through anger, not through blame, but through a graceful, intentional withdrawal that says, without words, I won't keep giving where I'm not received. The super empath doesn't need revenge. They don't waste time trying to prove someone wrong. What they do instead is focus inward on healing, growing, evolving. While the avoidant may have expected the empath to fall apart in their absence, to cling harder or spiral in confusion, something entirely different happens. The super empath chooses themselves. They redirect all the energy they once poured into trying to connect, fix, and understand the avoidant into rebuilding their own sense of peace and purpose. And when they do, they begin to thrive. Healing becomes their quiet revolution. They invest in their passions, their friendships, their physical and emotional well-being. They don't just move on, they level up. They get clearer on their standards. They stop explaining themselves to people who don't want to understand. They outgrow the emotional tug of war they were once caught in. And as they rise, they start to glow. It's not a glow that seeks attention. It's the kind that comes from inner alignment, peaceful, magnetic, grounded. The avoidant, from a distance, begins to notice. At first, maybe they're relieved by the space. Maybe they tell themselves it was best this way. But slowly, something changes. They start to feel the void, not because the super empath made a scene, but because they took their light with them. They stop checking in. They stop waiting. They stop emotionally orbiting the avoidance needs. And that absence isn't just a silence. It's a shift in dynamic. The person who once made them feel safe, seen, and understood is now completely focused on themselves. And here's the thing about pride. It struggles when faced with undeniable proof that it wasn't the center of someone's world anymore. The avoidant might have assumed the empath would be stuck in longing. Instead, they're watching someone they once emotionally held at arm's length become stronger, happier, more fulfilled without them. That realization hits differently. It's not about ego bruising in the traditional sense. It's about realizing they were holding back someone who had nothing but good intentions. There's a unique sting in witnessing someone glow after you couldn't show up for them. And the avoidant, who once feared intimacy more than loss, now has to sit with the weight of both. The super empath didn't need to say a word. Their evolution said everything. Not to hurt, but to heal. And healing, when done quietly and completely, often becomes the most undeniable truth of all. One of the most powerful things a super empath can do is forgive, not because they're weak or naive, but because they've done the emotional work to understand that forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about release. It's about letting go of the resentment that weighs them down. But what makes this even more impactful is that after they forgive, they don't return. They don't reopen the door. They walk away anyway. This is where the shift truly happens. The avoidant, often used to cycles of pulling away and being pulled back in, is suddenly faced with something unfamiliar, closure that doesn't come with a second chance. The super empath has seen behind the curtain. They've seen the emotional avoidance, the fear of intimacy, the resistance to vulnerability. And instead of staying stuck in the pain, they choose peace. They see the patterns for what they are, not as personal failures, but as signs of someone emotionally unequipped to meet them where they are. So they forgive, not with bitterness, not with a grudge, but with softness. I understand you couldn't give me what I needed. I accept that, and I'm not angry anymore. It's that level of emotional maturity that makes the avoidant feel something they aren't used to, regret. Because the empath doesn't scream or lash out. They don't try to make the avoidant feel guilty. They don't argue their worth. They simply let go with grace. And that kind of exit, it lingers. It stays with the avoidant long after the conversations end, because they realize, possibly for the first time, that someone loved them deeply, truly, unconditionally, and still walked away. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring more about themselves. And for someone who operates from avoidance and pride, that is a sobering realization. It breaks through the belief that emotional detachment protects them. It forces them to confront the idea that love isn't something they can keep at arm's length without consequence. The super empath doesn't need to win. They don't need the avoidant to come back and validate their worth. That validation already lives within them. Their power is in their ability to let go, to close a chapter with compassion instead of control. And in doing so, they leave the avoidant not with anger, but with a quiet lesson. Real love doesn't always stay to prove a point. It sometimes leaves to protect its peace. And that kind of departure says more than any words ever could. So what does this all mean? It means the super empath never needed to shout, chase, or break themselves to be heard. Their power was never in emotional control. It was in emotional clarity. By choosing not to match the avoidant's fear with desperation, but with grounded self-respect, they flipped the dynamic without even trying. They didn't crush pride with cruelty. They did it with calm, with healing, with boundaries, and with the silent power of walking away from anything that made them question their worth. The super empath didn't just survive the emotional push-pull. They transcended it. They didn't lose themselves trying to keep someone who was never fully present. And that's the real flex. That's the silent victory. Because nothing unsettles someone more than realizing the person they thought needed them no longer does. So if you're the empath, keep glowing, keep growing. If you're the avoidant, maybe it's time to ask what your distance is costing you. Because eventually, even the most patient hearts stop waiting. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for showing up for your own emotional truth. Whether you saw yourself in the empath, the avoidant, or somewhere in between, this conversation wasn't about blame. It was about awareness. And with awareness comes choice. Until next time, protect your peace, honor your boundaries, and never be afraid to choose yourself. Thank you and take care.